Okay. We're good? Okay.
Do you want to play?
It's not going to play. It's not going to play. I have to do it inside here, and then I'm going to...
Science and Alexander Legwegoh from Geography will be discussing food security perspectives in Central Africa. The final talk in our series is coming up on November 20th, and that is Evan Fraser, Lauren Sneyd, and Jennifer That was not how you pronounce it, sorry. I'll practice that for next time. They're going to be discussing the causes of food riots in Haiti and Cameroon. That's November 20th. So over to...
Okay. Well, I'd just like to thank Monique again for inviting me here and for organizing this really interesting series this year so far. It's been excellent, and I hope that we can live up to the last talk and the excitement that Carrie generated around her research. So today, I wanted to stress, I guess, at the outset that this is a presentation of a paper, not necessarily a presentation of an entire research project. So we've been working in Cameroon for about, Lauren and I, who's sitting over there, for about 4 years now, since 2010, on different topics. And this one that Alexander and I are here today to talk about is an extension of that field research. So I was thinking, why are we talking about perspectives last night? And I looked at my calendar and I said it was about 10 years ago. I was finishing my master's in Toronto, and my advisor said, here's some tickets to go to the Glen Gold studio at CBC Studios. So I went down there. I said, well, what's happening at the CBC Studios? Well, it was Jagdish Bhagwati. And Jagdish Bhagwati is a trade economist noted for his views on free trade. And he got up there and proclaimed himself to be the world's #1 free trader. And he also continued to criticize, in that context, Joseph Stiglitz for his advocacy on behalf of the downtrodden and the marginalized in the context of globalization. And I realized, I think, at that point that perspectives really do matter. When you might be a social scientist with a rigorous quantitative skill set on the one hand, on the other hand, you might also be advocating a particular point of view. And in that instance with Bhagwati drew my attention more to issues of perspective. We're going to have to keep this screen like this just for a second because the videos are too big to open. I'll pull them out of the program, then we can actually watch the full screen slideshow. So what am I talking about? We say here CIMAC. The community, the economic and monetary community of Central Africa. So what is it? Well, it's basically Central African Republic, Chad, Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, and I've forgotten one here, Congo-Brazzaville. So the Republic of Congo also goes by the name of Congo-Brazzaville in the literature. So if someone says, well, what is Central Africa? Why aren't you talking about the DRC? Well, there's a reason for that, because there's an economic community of Central African states, of which the DRC is a part. But the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, they don't share the same currency as CIMAC. So the Central African Economic and Monetary Community has a common currency, the CFA, the Central African franc, and that's managed by the Bank of Central African States. So we said, let's talk about CIMAC. So that just gives you a sense of what it looks like in terms of a region, a swath up from the Gulf of Guinea. But then we've also got kind of some specific areas. So this little green dot here is the jaw, and I'm going to take you there right now. This is a picture. Well, I guess I can just play it. Hopefully, we can play. Yeah, there we go. Maybe not. Okay, perfect. It's the best I can do in terms of size. This is the president's village. The president of Cameroon wanted to have a small-scale rubber project to support the villagers of his home village a few years back. So the rubber company in Cameroon, a company that was called HeavyCam, was bought by a Singapore-listed firm called GMG Global, which is now controlled by something called Sinochem. Sinochem is China Chemical. China Chemical is the majority shareholder in this operation in the President's Village. This is going to be a 55,000 hectare rubber plantation in the President's Village. The initial idea had been to make it a smallholder rubber operation, which would have enabled smallholders to cultivate food at the same time as rubber. But here we have basically primary tropical rainforest going down for these rubber plants that were just put in the ground. This is December last year when we were invited as guests to view this plantation. And in development, I think there were maybe 1,000 hectares that had already gone down as of the end of November last year when we visited, and we hope to get the invitation to go back this year, although we were told, try not to put this out in the media, we might have problems getting back into the country. The interesting point here is that they're trying to cultivate rubber and rice together. You can't really see it in this particular shot, but the idea is that while the rubber is growing up, you might get a little bit of rice. And I just wanted to give you some sort of visual representation of what we're on about today. So hopefully, if I can yank these slides out of here, we will actually be able to open the slideshow because they're just too big. Okay, well, we'll just go with this if that suits everybody else, because you can see it. So why are we here? Why am I talking about sumac? Well, part of it relates to my doctoral research on cotton in Africa. I had thought that I was going to go to Cameroon, which has a very strong cotton economy in the north. I was concurrently with my PhD working with the North-South Institute in Ottawa. They do development research, and an economist from Cameroon was based in Ottawa when I was there. His name was Sunday Khan, and Sunday said, come to Cameroon, there's some really interesting things happening in the cotton sector. Well, in 2013, it actually turns out that I probably should have gone to Cameroon to talk about, or to learn about the cotton sector. The head of the National Cotton Association, the company that buys and all the cotton in the country, provides all the inputs, he's now in jail. And he also was, at the same time as being the head of the cotton company, the head of the National Football Federation. And I'm sure Alexander can tell you a little bit about the linkages between football, cotton, and corruption in Cameroon. So I resolved to go to Cameroon. We went and conducted some research on Forest Stewardship Council certification of forests there, produced some papers on timber, comparing it with cotton. And then last year in 2012, proceeded to go back to Cameroon on a couple of occasions to take a look at food security and the issue of perspectives. So this paper today comes out of a growing interest in food security in that particular region due to the, I guess you could say, the scaled up interest of lots of different actors in the region's food economy. So China, Russia, India, Brazil. Indian tractors are all over the place in Central Africa and Cameroon right now. Lots of Russian inputs, fertilizer and chemicals from Russia. Lots of Chinese engagement, as I just showed, on the president's village, Sinochem, but also through trade, Chinese rice, Vietnamese rice. So there's a lot of new interest in the food economy in Cameroon by new players in the global economy, by the BRIC economies, you could call them, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and others. So we were trying to figure out what the impacts, what are local perspectives on the impacts of these kinds of global actors on food in Cameroon last year. And building from that project, while Lauren and I were there last December, we kept hearing from people, the Gabonese, they're coming across the border into Cameroon. They're buying all of our plantains. We can't get access to plantains. We don't want to eat the Chinese rice all the time. We want to actually eat our traditional cultural foods. Why are they able to buy up all our plantains? Why can't we afford them anymore? So our direct experience in that context essentially enabled us to say, well, let's take a look at CMAC as a region, because it's increasingly being drawn together, the economies of Gabon, Cameroon, Congo, Brazzaville, Chad, Central African Republic, and to a lesser extent, Equatorial Guinea. So that's the why. I think there's increasing food attention to the region, and there's also an increasingly regional economy on food. So the heavy lifting for this, and this is why I really feel that I shouldn't be so front and center in this. I mean, the major heavy lifting was done by a team of people over the last summer. So luckily, Alexander Legwegoh knows what he's doing with data analysis software, because I had never used any sort of data analysis software. I'd always coded my own data from interviews. This is the first attempt that I had ever made with this particular paper we're presenting today to actually, well, what is this thing called hyper research? Maybe you can tell us when we talk about methodology, but I'd never previously worked with this kind of thing, but it seemed like a good fit. I also was really particularly lucky to have had a student approach me at the end of April last year, Angela Sweeney, who's here right there in the blue. And Angela is one of the University of Guelph's presidential scholars, and she was a presidential research assistant last summer. And I believe you coded upwards of 1,000 documents for this particular paper. So that was a huge, huge load of work. And another undergraduate student at the university who's not here right now, I don't think, my glasses aren't on, but Tekla Van Boesel is currently the co-chair of WUSC on campus, and she also made significant contributions to data analysis. So we had a bunch of people working together last summer here in Guelph when we were not traveling around Cameroon or Central Africa to talk about this topic. We talked about it here and made our way through last summer. So the Research Support Network in Cameroon that's been really helpful for us over the years, C4, that's the Center for International Forestry Research. So they've been essentially the contacts and a lot of the documents and the data that we were able to gather for this particular paper are a direct result of the contacts we made through the Center for International Forestry Research in Yaoundé. And we also had some support from CG over in Waterloo and from SHIRK in the case of Lauren. So I think what I want to do then is just kind of give you a sense of the research question and then turn things over to Alexander to talk about why we're asking this question, like the so what for the study, and then to get into the methodological considerations. So the banana plantain example is essentially one rationale for studying these countries as a group. And I would argue that there are a couple more rationales for studying these countries as a group, even though there's a bunch of different challenges within them. And here's what I mean by this. Food aid deliveries are very different. If you go to Chad, the Sahel Band, if we go back to our map here, up here, and I think you can actually see it, you've got a lot of potential food security issues in terms of availability. So drought-prone areas or flooding. And down here, I'd say the food security issues can sometimes be a little bit different, relating to the adequacy of diets or food pricing. So there's different challenges across the region. The kilocalories that are available per day, they differ. Congolese and Gabonese, many more Congolese, for example, if we look at Congo-Brazzaville, fall below the national poverty line than people in Gabon. I think the number is, it's about I believe it's 1 in 14 in Gabon and maybe 1 in 3 in Congo-Brazzaville fall below the national poverty line. So there's some really interesting differences across Central Africa. And of course you've got this kind of current conflict ongoing in Central African Republic. You've got post-conflict status here. There was a war at the same time the DRC fell into conflict in the 1990s in Brazzaville. And you've got countries that have been fairly stable, even though Boko Haram is operating out of here in northern Cameroon, and that's causing some instability next door in Nigeria. So there's lots of differences. But I would argue there's also a lot of similarities, and this makes it useful for using them together. The first is that if we go back to the map, oil and gas, the extractive sector is just, it's massive. And you've got the Chad-Cameroon oil pipeline here. You've got a project, one of the first of its kind in the world, directly on the border of Brazzaville and Cameroon. This is the Umbalam oil project controlled by Sundance Resources. They're constructing a railroad right here to the port at Kribi, which is where the terminus of the Chad-Cameroon oil pipeline is. And Gabon is also thinking about putting some resources through there as well, including another train line here from Brazzaville that would hook up with the Gabonese train line, and all of it's going to go out here at this port called Kribi, which used to have nice beaches. So there's lots of things drawing the region together, not the least of which is CMAC, which is the Commission for the Central African Economic and Monetary Community. It's based in Bangui in the Central African Republic, and that is driving regional trade integration and the reduction of tariff barriers on food. So it's essentially becoming one regional food economy, and governments have given up the policy tools that they could used to have at their disposal to control food inflows into and out of the country across regional borders. So I say, it's good to study it together. That's why we're trying to do it. And what are we asking here? Well, essentially what we're asking is that, in what ways, if any, are perspectives on food security in CMAC amongst stakeholder groups similar or different? That's the ultimate question here. In what ways do identifiable stakeholders take similar lines on food security challenges, and in what ways do they take different lines? And here, another reason why we're talking about perspectives, this is the National Statistics Agency. It's dark in this image. It's a 2-story building. And so unfortunately, that's not really coming through so well. But if you want to check it out, come on up and look at my computer a little later. There's not a lot of activity there. So maybe Alexander can help us with the so whats, and I'll switch the mic over to.
So beyond the context-specific factors that Adam has talked about, so all the interesting things that are going on in CEMAC, we found that there was just a drought of research in that area. We did a basic Google Scholar search for literature on food security in Central Africa region and using the country specifics, and you would hardly find anything. So we actually noted that for the first 100 search, there was just about 5 papers that were loosely related to food security in the region. And most of the time in that region, they'll tend to talk about forestry and then try to link it back to food security, and food security just becomes a buzzword or a line inside people talking about food security, about forestry and about climate change, and even in terms of the literature from other perspectives, from other people, so from government, from civil society, we didn't really get a lot of people engaging a lot in terms of the whole idea of food security. Food security was part of the discourse, not the central idea, which is quite different from what is going on in other parts of Africa. For example, in Southern Africa, we have huge organized research bodies that are looking at food security specifically. For example, in Southern Africa, you have the AFSUN, so African Food Security Urban Network, which is looking at urban food security in Southern Africa specifically. And they've actually done a huge baseline survey looking at 11 cities, coming up with interesting results, which states that about 77% of the urban poor are food insecure in Southern Africa. And they're doing other research projects which are coming out from that, like looking at community-based food security, looking at different projects, looking at trying to engage with policymakers, which was what we were hoping we could find even at a smaller scale in Central Africa. Similarly to in East Africa, there's a lot of academic research done on food security, especially linked to climate change in that region and agricultural patterns. So we were somewhat surprised by that drought of research in that region. And we decided with that in mind, we decided to ask the question, why is there a drought of research, and B, why is the focus only on forestry? Maybe because that's what the UN is funding. Maybe that's where people are getting funding. People are getting research funding for. And so it made it quite interesting to ask the questions why and how are different people talking about food security beyond the academic realm. And this paper kind of came out from that idea of let's start an agenda setting paper which would set up what different people are talking about, and then hopefully from that more academic research could come out from that.
I'm just going to try to open up maybe a different version of this in a PDF to see if we can actually get the screen. Okay. Well, my computer is having a hard time, so there it is. Okay. This might be easier. Here, lots of charts, lots of food. There we go. Okay. In the image there, that's the guy with the glasses, with kind of short hair on the left. That's Olivier de Schutter, and he's the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. And we're not using his framework just because he bought us lunch at Kribi when he was in this. Kribi is the terminus, as I mentioned, of the Chad-Cameroon oil pipeline. He was there in Cameroon in July 2012 on mission to do a report on Cameroon. In 2012, he did reports on 2 countries, Canada and Cameroon, and released those reports in January of 2013 on the same day in Geneva. So we were sitting there with Olivier de Schutter while we're enhancing our own food security, eating some fish with chips, and we wanted to kind of take a look at. I think the impetus behind this is that the more that I read what Olivier is writing, the more it seems that there are competing perspectives on each aspect of food security that he talks about. So when Olivier de Schutter presents his reports to the United Nations Human Rights Council, or when he goes around the world to discuss food security or the right to food, I mean, this is another issue because he's the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. But everything that he's talking about can be linked back to this thing called food security. Food security comes out of the 1996 Rome Summit on the topic and led to a particular definition of food security. His is slightly different. But suffice it to say, he focuses on 3 dimensions of food security, or the conditions necessary to realize the right to food. Physical availability of food, economic and social access to food, and dietary adequacy, which can include nutrition, but also cultural appropriateness, which is a very hot button issue, as we might find out in a little bit. So understanding the food security and the conditions necessary to realize the right to food, we figured DeSchutter shows, he breaks his prescriptions for reform, for policy change down based on those 3 areas, those 3 thematic areas, but we find on every single one of those areas, there are perspectives at play. There are competing political perspectives. And we've got to draw those out, because when Olivier DeSchutter says, here's what is needed to enhance availability, somebody else in the country where he's writing the report on is going to be saying something different about what is needed to enhance the physical availability of food. And somebody else might be saying something different about what is needed to enhance the economic access to food in that country. And somebody else might be saying something about what is needed to make diets more appropriate or adequate. So we thought, let's bring some perspectives in and take a look at where things come out at the end of the day. And through associating specific terms with each of DeSchutter's analytical categories, we essentially differentiate the perspectives of different stakeholders on food in Central Africa. So we take a look at groups that we've defined as businesses, profit-making organizations, civil society groups, the nonprofit sector, governments themselves, and multilateral and bilateral organizations, so UN organizations or development agencies from the West. So essentially we differentiate perspectives on the ways and means to achieve greater food security in CIMAC by taking a look at those 4 stakeholder groups and their perspectives on each aspect of availability, accessibility, and adequacy of food security. So that's, I think maybe we'll let Alexander describe some of what that might look like in terms of the language. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So So in terms of the 3 different perspectives, we had lots of meetings and tried to read through literature over and over and try to come up with different ways in which people were talking about accessibility, availability, accessibility, or inadequacy. Because when you're looking at the literature, when you're reading the literature and trying to code the literature, you wouldn't necessarily find people talking about physical availability, but they'll talk about it in different ways. So in terms of availability, physical availability, people are mostly talking about it in terms of production, supply side, domestic production, import deficit. Interesting enough, in that region, there was a lot of talk about palm oil deficits. They'll also be talking about food aid, technological innovation that would increase production, technological input, supply, seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, tractors. There's a lot of talk about tractors. Tools, efficiency, so just efficiency, the whole agricultural sector, productivity, technology, extension, weather patterns, flood. There's a lot of flood in northern Cameroon and Central African Republic, drought, seasonality, harvest, and just sheer volume. So those were the themes that came out when we're talking about availability. In terms of access, here they're mostly talking about social and economic access, but in terms of markets, there's a lot of talk about, in Cameroon, you hear the term buy and sell, which Lauren can tell you a lot about. So buy and sell are people who buy and sell, so buy and sell. And demand, the other things which came up with trade, price, cost, inflation, marketing, storage. There's a lot of talk about transportation and road access, so access to markets, ports, a lot of interest around the ports, the different ports in Cameroon, customs, issues with custom and import issues, corruption around there too, cross-border trade. Adam talked about that, people coming to buy off all the plantain. Also there's a lot of talk about income, resources, entitlement, inequality. We found a lot of interesting stuff on gender too, purchasing power, price fluctuation. A lot of interest around refrigeration, so storage of food, oil subsidies, gas, so cooking gas, charcoal for cooking too, water, electricity, coping strategies, and then a lot of discuss around breweries. Cameroonians love their beer. So the breweries are buying off a lot of the maize, so some discussion around that. Food processing, tariffs, and police, so the police holding up trade, and a lot of issues around perishability of food.
Head should be swimming with terms now. It's going to get worse.
In terms of nutritional and cultural adequacy, there's a lot of, we were mostly looking at issues around consumption, eating, living, food safety, and we would like to stress here the food safety versus safety, which there was a lot of safety issues, which was more human safety versus food safety, health, nutrition, nutritious food, culturally appropriate food, a lot of issues around micronutrients, so vitamins, supplements, staple food, traditional food. Rice just seemed to be a recurrent theme because people don't like eating a lot of the rice. Strange, because when I was a kid, we used to eat rice on Sundays in Cameroon and maybe on Christmas Day, like we eat. But now rice, people eat it every day. That's kind of the new staple. Dietary diversity, nutritional knowledge, malnutrition, overnutrition. People are getting obese too. I've talked about micronutrient deficiency, sports drinks, and then we also had a lot of the specific food-specific categories, which were interesting to actually look at, because sometimes people just kind of default to the food category rather than to talking about it in terms of nutritious food or culturally appropriate foods such as cassava, gari, which is made out of cassava, maize, bongo chobi, so a type of delicacy, cocoyam, plantain, ero. Ero, they talk about it a lot because it's a lot in the forest literature. Forest literature is one of the known timber forest product. And ero or okok would be the term that people talk about.
We didn't talk about caterpillars though, although they're in the picture there on the plate.
Yeah.
Okay, so methodology and limitations.
So in terms of the methodology, since we had all these codes, these words, we're actually searching through the literature to find these words. But let me take you back in terms of how we got the data that, since I mentioned the fact that there's a drought of data. So what we did was we tried to look for data in two phases. The first part was to look at media reports on that region. So media reports on food security in that region. Kind of I think I would say a really simple search that you could do using a news media sourcing website, Factivia, which the library has. And we just went into Factivia, had the country specific, so you can actually specify which countries the literature should be coming from or the news reports should be coming from. And using the keywords food security or sécurité alimentaire, which since some of the countries are French, or most of the countries are French. And we used a temporal search between January of 2007 till June. That was when we're actually looking for literature. That's when we started doing the work. And with that search from CEMAC regions, we came up with 602 newspaper articles. That was the first body of literature that we had. The second one was for us to actually go now into the different stakeholder groups and actually search. So we split up the countries. Each of us took 2 countries, I think, and did a lot of digging into going to specific websites of civil society, corporations, so businesses, multilateral and bilateral organizations, government departments, and just basically looking for anything that was related to food security and just collecting all of that, aggregating all of that literature. I think the toughest job was Lawrence on trying to look for literature in using Spanish from Equatorial Guinea to find literature on food security in that region and trying to translate that. We came up in total with about 42 documents on corporations, so on businesses So that would include their CSR reports and all the rest. We came up with 34 documents published by civil society groups, 36 documents published by governments, and 72 published by bilateral and multilateral organizations. And these were of varying sizes. I think the bilateral and multilateral were mostly the longest. They were just broad reports of 200 pages. And maybe you'd have within that a few 5 pages related to food security, but the rest is just all promoting government policies and government programs. Now, having that, the next issue was now to go into it to actually code it. So the three different perspectives became, if any of you are familiar with hyper research, which I can just talk about now, it's a qualitative software tool which you can use to code your data. Within hyper research, the three different perspectives became our groups. So we're not actually coding saying availability, accessibility, or adequacy, but we're actually coding based on the themes that I've talked about now. So when we read in the literature and they're talking about culturally acceptable food, you would actually code using that code. So the themes that I talked about were our codes, which we're using to go through that data now to code the data. What we did since we're all in an academic institution, to talk about reliability or to think about our reliability of how of our study was to actually look through 20 documents first, try to code them, see whether we're on the same page with the people who were doing with the rest of the research team, and then let the research assistants code the rest of the document. But what we also did within that process was also to have them code on on a Google Drive. So we're always going back to check whether the codes were used appropriately, and that really helped in terms of making sure that what we'll be reporting in the next little while is actually reliable. The one limitation that I would like to talk about too is the idea that the media we noted that there was a media bias, and that's why we went to the second stage of actually going through those different stakeholders to look at their own literature, because even though within the media they would be saying that they were reporting that civil society says people want culturally acceptable food, or they're reporting about an event that civil society held, we also noted that there's a media bias. So maybe Anglophone Cameroon media is talking about certain civil society and a certain bias because they have a bias against the government, and so it's almost like pitching the civil society against the government. So we didn't rely only on the media sources. The media sources, we just use them within the data to kind of contextualize the rest of the data. The research tool also helped us, hyper research also helped us come up with data with quantitative data or statistical data, if you want to put it that way, which kind of helps us put in perspective how the different stakeholders were talking about the different themes or different perspectives from the Shooters framework. And I'll pass it over to Adam now to talk about it.
So then by taking what we've already said, just walking away from the methodology for a second and back to the framework that we applied. So this is the DeShooter piece, bringing him in. We basically created a paper with this kind of a structure where we focus on corporations, the perspectives on availability that corporations articulate in their CSR reports or their annual reports, their perspectives on accessibility and public information, advertisements, and also on adequacy. And that's kind of you've got 4 sections of the paper here: corporations, civil society, government, and multilaterals and bilaterals. And under each section, or each subsection, I guess, availability, accessibility, or adequacy, we talk about the statistical content, and then we talk about what the stats don't get. And this is where it gets interesting, because the stats give you one perspective of what's happening, and then the actual content of the materials is just fascinating, because it's not, you can't just walk into this and say business and civil society groups don't see eye to eye. Well, guess what? They do on a bunch of things. And governments and civil society sometimes see eye to eye as well. So you got to take a look at the specifics. And this is what we try to do. So in the media sample, like Alexander was saying, this was just the contextual piece. So we use the media sample, recognizing that there's some bias within media reporting throughout the region, and a lot of media that's not free in particular places. Think about Chad or Central African Republic. We have 42% of the hits that we had on our codes were on availability, about 40%, roughly equal, on accessibility themes, and then a smaller proportion on adequacy. So this was across those 602, I think it was 602 articles or reports from the media. And again, from Alexander mentioned, it was Factiva, which includes All Africa, Interpress Service, and a bunch of other media outlets. So this is, I guess, the context that you can see here in the media. Major attention to availability and accessibility, a little bit less on the nutrition and the culture. Now let's just head right into the business perspectives then. Now this is from the own documents produced by businesses themselves. And I think the first thing to note here is, well, this is from 42 annual CSR reports, annual report CSR reports, and publicly available documents. In terms of what we saw, a major focus on availability, a little bit less on accessibility type themes, and you know, relative lack of attention to adequacy. And well, what do all these things mean? Well, let's take a look at availability. On availability, which was the preoccupation, many companies in their communications talk about sustainability. They talk about extension. So 20 of the 77 were sustainability, 19 were on extension, so the extension of agricultural knowledge to producers, 6 were on production, and a few on technologies. So in the materials we reviewed, corporations that were not directly involved in agriculture didn't generally talk about food, even if they weren't linking sustainability to food. Sorry, they talk about sustainability, but they would do so in ways that weren't linked to food unless they were directly involved in agricultural production, which is understandable because if you're a company and you're not involved in agricultural production, you might not necessarily talk about it. But what's interesting here in this data is a divergence between companies that believe to enhance availability you must have food aid and companies that believe that domestic production needs to be maximized to secure more availability. So for example, Heracles, which is a firm that's they're making a 55,000 hectare oil palm plantation in the southwest of Cameroon, where Alexander is from, not very far away. And this firm is supporting the giving of food donations as a durable solution to food security issues in the area. So aid, rice, and fish. Give them rice, give them fish. This is a sustainable solution. That's how they're presenting it. Whereas other firms, including Sneyd, which is operating in 5 different countries, it's an agricultural processor, wheat and sugar primarily. They're talking about the need for local consumption of domestic production. So increasing domestic production of foods like sugar and consuming that locally as a way that could enhance availability. So you've got this kind of divide amongst corporations on how to actually increase the availability of food, whether it's just giving aid or whether it's actually producing more domestically. Now, some companies offer extension advice. Most of those hits on extension were actually from one company. So across all these documents that we reviewed, one company actually was very obsessed with helping producers to think through the production strategies, and many others didn't even touch it. So that was interesting. On technologies, though, I think there is a huge corporate divide between corporations involved in conventional inputs, so conventional agrochemicals, pesticides, fertilizer, herbicides, and those that would support more of an organic agriculture. So Sneyd, which is a firm that I already mentioned, that's managed by the current head of the French Council of Investors in Africa, Alexandre Villegren, is on record as saying that smallholder organic alternative inputs are where we want to go. And at the same time, Olam, which is a Singapore-based commodity trader, they're constructing, in partnership with Tata Chemical and the government of Gabon, a massive fertilizer plant in Libreville. They're on record as saying we need to have more agrochemical production in the region to ensure available food. So you've got corporations saying smallholder organics are the way to availability, and you've got others, Olam, saying the exact opposite and doing the exact opposite. This is going to be, I think, a $1.5 billion fertilizer plant in Gabon. Now that's the availability piece. Now on accessibility, as you would suspect, many companies are really happy to talk about income generation, how large-scale agricultural plantations, how resource operations, extractive industries lead to income, which enables people to purchase food. So getting a job is a source of food security in that literature. And that's I guess pretty self-explanatory. Now on the adequacy piece, there wasn't a lot of attention to this. Health was the preoccupation. About six of those hits were on health. And Heineken, actually, through one of its subsidiaries in Congo-Brazzaville, Brasserie du Congo, they talk about nutrition education and brewing a better future. So making smart consumer choices. This was their public information. But not a lot of nutrition gets into the central tenets of CSR policy. So companies that are very big, Marathon Oil and Equatorial Guinea, ExxonMobil, they don't necessarily talk about nutrition whatsoever. So it's just a few outliers that are focusing on that. So we argue that nutrition and dietary adequacy is not necessarily at the forefront of corporate communications on food, and cultural appropriateness is basically not on the radar. So that's the essence of the corporate perspectives. Well, what about civil society? Well, here you can see preponderance of attention has been devoted to accessibility challenges, the challenges of making food more accessible for people, and then kind of also attention to availability, 23% of communications on that theme, and terms that we coded as being associated with adequacy, also making it in to that literature quite a bit. So taking a look at some civil society views of the 65 instances where civil society groups talk about availability, about 20 of those we found were on sustainability themes, and in about equal measure were on production themes. And interestingly, on the sustainability side, most civil society organizations are talking about the environmental costs of conventional, extensive agricultural growth, and they offer a sustainable alternatives. They're saying smallholder agriculture is more sustainable. There are just huge environmental costs associated with extensive growth of large-scale agricultural projects like the rubber and palm projects we've taken a look at. That's not surprising. But what is surprising, I think, is that civil society groups tend to link plantations to food insecurity directly. You're pulling people out of food production for local consumption. This is whether it's for resource development, employment on oil and gas, or whether it's for the development of plantations. The idea that there is some connection between wage labor and food insecurity. Now, they also, civil society groups were challenging across the board perspectives on productivity that emphasize the old view of productivity, the per unit of output per hectare approach over a yearly time horizon, not over a longer time horizon. So, emphasizing the dangers of conventional inputs as well. So these are the standard kind of critiques of conventional agriculture that you would expect. What I find to be pretty interesting, though, is this massive attention that civil society groups are paying to accessibility issues. And when they're doing so, they're talking largely about incomes, inequality, and resources. They also talk about gender and water issues, but for the most part, the preponderance of communications are on income, on inequality, and resources. And the belief is that formal employment reinforces dependence on imported processed foods and fuels the atrophy of domestic agricultural systems. Civil society groups across, I think, 5 of the 6 countries actually articulate language just like this. If formal employment makes people dependent on imported processed foods, this atrophies domestic agriculture. It actually renders the place less food secure than it otherwise would be, which is pretty critical. I mean, this is another interesting aspect is this inequality piece from civil society. The inequality of access to land is just all over this literature. So if you're talking about inequalities in civil society, you're probably talking about land access issues. And I've got a lot of quotes, but probably not a lot of time to start to head in that direction. I can maybe in the Q&A head there. On adequacy, though, I think what was really, is you're going to see quite a bit of a difference with the corporations. On adequacy, about half the communications were on culture and traditional food, and the other half were on health and safety of food. So, there's a big attention to traditional land rights. And in Chad, a civil society group, I think Angela might remember this one, was pretty straight up on this one, talking about changing food cultures and food ways. And in particular, this was related to the oil industry in Chad. Employment in the oil industry in Chad, male control over wages has fueled alcoholism, prostitution, and spousal conflict. It's created a bar culture and a local alcoholic drink industry to the detriment of traditional diets. That's just one quote from a civil society organization in Chad. So the traditional diets are disappearing because everybody's got an incentive to go to the bar and keep up with the Jones. You got to hang out after work. And food safety, I guess, is also a theme here. And also lots of attention to acute malnutrition. So I'm just kind of rushing through this. There's a lot of data. Government perspectives. Now here you can see something that might look strange or odd if civil society is independent of governments. It seems that governments and civil society are definitely talking about accessibility issues in a fairly equal proportion. About 60% of government's communications are on accessibility issues, and it was about the same for civil society groups. 10% of their communications were on nutrition, and about 31% on availability challenges. Well, let's just get into some of the material from government documents. Now, these are from documents produced by ministries, by offices of the presidency or the prime minister, by particular regulators. So on availability, a lot of the attention was on, sustainability was actually the most commonly used term when governments are talking about food. In Gabon, for instance, they rush to point out in their public relations material that Gabonese palm oil is going to be 100% certified by the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. So they're very clearly trying to make a link between the operations of Olam and Siet Gabon, the two big palm oil producers, to this governance initiative globally on making palm oil more sustainable. In Cameroon, ministers are also pushing the idea that you've got to do something about large-scale hunting. So let's domesticate wild animals and get rid of the bushmeat trade. So there's a lot of attention to increasing availability through domesticating cane rats, duikers, which are small antelopes, and other foods that have been traditionally hunted, and turning those into kind of small-scale operations. Which is interesting, because it's not just that governments are supporting the large-scale palm oil producers, they're also supporting this kind of development of a smaller-scale agriculture. Now, interestingly, though, there is a drive in this literature here on availability for greater food self-sufficiency. Every single government in CIMAC wants to be more food self-sufficient. Many of them are supporting a drive at the World Trade Organization right now to enable that agenda, and we could talk about it later if you want. But essentially, the Gabonese convey this the best. They want food self-sufficiency, but in a particular kind of way. They want a big push for new investments to develop intensive agriculture and agro-industry for food and cash crops. So alongside subsistence and that idea of maybe domesticating wild animals, in Gabon, you've got a big push for intensive agriculture and agro-industry coming out of the government literature. Now, on accessibility, governments have been absolutely concerned with prices and inequality issues. There were subsidies introduced after the food price crisis, 07 and 08, to try to rein in some of the issues that might be discussed in the next talk in the series on food riots. And on inequality and addressing inequality, there's been an attempt in the government literature to rationalize the subsidy regimes or to talk about reforming the subsidy regimes and what that might look like. There's also, I think, in some ways, though, and this is interesting from my perspective. You've got particular governments that continue to denigrate agriculture and seek to rely on foreign foods or foods that are of foreign origin. So Equatorial Guinea, for example, is kind of indicative here. They have this perspective in their advertisements that have appeared in Jeune Afrique. From the Gulf of Guinea is a stream of crudes flowing that is so significant that in just a few short years it has transformed Equatorial Guinea from an agricultural backwater into one of sub-Saharan Africa's largest oil exporters, with a GDP per capita higher than many European countries. Why wouldn't you want to rely on foreign foods if you're richer than many European countries, I guess. But there's still some palpable kind of denigration of agricultural activities in the government communications that we reviewed. And you could say that kind of spills into the perspectives on adequacy that governments articulate. Very few of them, but when they do, it's often very paternalistic. In the Central African Republic, the previous government, help me out here, Francois Bozize, who was turfed by these rebels over Christmas and throughout the New Year last year. Bozize, in one of his government reports, talks about the poor use that women are making of the nutrition, education, resources, and training that our government supplies. So it's poor people's fault for not taking advantage of these wonderful things that we've given them. So this is, again, this paternalistic view on health coming from governments. Now, here's, I guess, the final grouping of stakeholders were multilateral and bilateral organizations. Now these largely, we have I think bilaterals were in a smaller proportion, so it's really dominated by, this could be a weakness which we didn't discuss in the paper that we've submitted, but anyway. Multilateral organizations kind of dominate this, but 49% of the communications are on availability challenges and a roughly equal proportion on the other two. Let's just see if I can slide down the page here. Here we go. So what were they saying that was different or the same as others? Well, I think one thing that comes clearly out of this literature is attention to what to do to the food after it's produced. If governments aren't talking about it and civil society organizations aren't talking about it, what do you actually do to preserve food? What about refrigeration, cold storage? What about just regular storage to keep pests out of there? So there's a huge attention in that literature to the development of post-harvest systems as a means to contribute to enhancing availability. There's also, I think, some interesting divides, and in addition to kind of the multilateral organizations and bilaterals recognizing that in addition to food aid as a means to increase availability, you also have to work on this post-harvest front. There is a divide between groups like the IMF that view agricultural investment as a source of stability, and what they mean by this is increasing the component of GDP or the footprint of agriculture in the regional economy is going to make it more stable because it's going to de-link it a bit from oil. If all of these countries have been fundamentally dependent on oil exports and revenues from oil exports that can be highly volatile, a source of stability in the IMF view is to have more agricultural investment and a greater attention to agriculture in the region. Whereas the FAO comes at the investment in agriculture as the breadbasket question. Let's get food produced for the region. So if you're in a ministry office, at the Ministry of Agriculture, Minadur in Yaoundé, you're going to hear the IMF talking about the need for agriculture to make the economy more broadly stable, and you're going to hear the FAO talking about how investment in agriculture is going to actually make us more food secure. So this is a really curious divide, and this also happens in the advocacy for extension. So the FAO talks about the need for small scale attention, attention to smallholders and family farms and extending knowledge to those people, whereas the IMF would argue that extension needs to be about large scale. It needs to be, tractors, yes. Yeah, agreed. Now on accessibility themes, fuel and price have always been a big concern of the IMF in particular. Concerns that the government's attempt to subsidize fuel have been captured by the top 20% of the income distribution, and that poor people are not actually getting access to subsidized fuel, and the implications of this very expensive fuel subsidy regime that's been introduced. I think in most countries in the region they did subsidize fuel. More multilateral communications, and this is interesting if you're someone who's a student of the UN system, and especially the UNDP. Most multilateral organizations are focusing on the economic aspects of accessibility, so prices and costs, rather than the social aspects of access to food, like gender. So gender doesn't really factor in so much in this literature, and when it does, it's used in very, very loose ways in support of maybe the Millennium Development Goals, and less about specific interventions that would empower women to have better food access. Now on adequacy, and this is, I guess, another big point that I would make, is that basically everything is about malnutrition. Nothing coming out of the multilateral and bilateral community on dietary diversity in our review at all, traditional diets, cultural appropriateness. So international organizations are talking about women and children, school feeding, addressing nutrient and caloric deficiencies, and they're expressing concern about average diets. Now the one thing that does come out in this literature that doesn't come out anywhere else is something that we're calling a CMAX nutritional paradox, which is the persistent undernutrition in the context of overnutrition. So while people are relying more on fats and starches, carbohydrates, sedentary lifestyles come in, and you've got this kind of interesting paradox of undernutrition existing in a region where there's overnutrition is on the rise. And I think I can safely say that these organizations don't necessarily talk about taste, cultural appropriateness that often. So what are some conclusions from this very large literature review? Well, I mean, if you just go by the numbers on availability, businesses and multilateral organizations talk about the physical availability of food a lot more than governments and civil society groups do. in this literature. Accessibility, governments have been obsessed over incomes and prices, and civil society groups have also talked about accessibility quite a bit, more than say multilateral organizations and businesses. And adequacy is discussed less. Multilaterals and bilaterals discuss it the most, but as I said, it's highly concentrated on nutrition. Civil society groups talk about health and tradition in kind of equal proportion. And governments and businesses don't necessarily touch that. Now, what we argue and what you've heard us kind of do in this presentation is that these figures don't necessarily capture a bunch of gaps. Just if you look at the raw figures, you're going to see, yeah, there are divides. There's divides on perspectives from these various stakeholder groups. But I'll just summarize a few that I've already covered. So there is a big divide between businesses and civil society on sustainability. Corporate divides on production. So you've got companies that say food aid is going to solve the availability challenge, and others that say we need small-scale local organic inputs, while other firms say let's construct a giant fertilizer factory. You've got this divide between the IMF and the FAO over agriculture as a source of stability or agriculture as a source of sustenance. You've got also some interesting divides between business and civil society, and turning to accessibility, on employment, civil society being highly critical of formal sector employment as a contribution to food security. This is something that I was really, even having interviewed people from all these stakeholder groups on a related topic, I never really got that sense until we did this review of just how critical civil society groups are of the formal sector in these resource-dependent economies. And civil society and business are actually not always divided, and this is this point I made earlier in the talk. Civil society and business are very much aligned on marketing bottlenecks. Both businesses and groups that are advocating on behalf of people in a nonprofit way are suggesting that the police, the roads, the ports, it's all bad news for people, and it's not just business that's paying, it's people themselves that are paying, and this is bad for people's access economically to food. And I guess on the adequacy piece, there is a general inattention to culture, except from civil society. There's paternalism, as I mentioned in that quote, and then there's this paradox of over and under nutrition. So the implications here from our study, I got to wrap this. I can't believe we went an hour. Perspectives matter. Perspectives absolutely matter. I said it at the outset with the reference to Jagdish Bhagwati. Trying to understand it is very complicated. This is a ridiculously large review of literature. And some of these things we probably could have guessed at the outset, but now we actually have some data to back up our claims. So the big questions moving forward that we ask in the paper in a more detailed way, and then we'll just kind of leave hanging in the room right now, like who has the power to realize their vision for food security? Taking a look at this sea of perspectives, who's actually empowered to get the vision for availability that they want? When particular stakeholder groups come together and push for one vision on accessibility, do they overwhelm a minority viewpoint? If so, how? So lots of questions arise from this research. What we want to do, we kind of recognize that basically everything we've reviewed here is an elite source. Empowered people have written these reports. People who are from abroad have written these reports. People who are in government ministries who are relatively well off. But we haven't really heard much from regular people in CIMAC, whether it's Boya, people in Boya in Cameroon, where Alexander is from, or elsewhere. We just don't know. So we want to know more, and I think respecting those viewpoints that's going to be the order of the day moving forward. So for now, we'll just open it up to questions. I know there's a lot of information coming at you. Hopefully some of it was useful, and thanks so much for hearing us out. Sure thing. Yeah. Kate.
Thank you. This is really interesting. It seems to me that one important distinction between these different groups is how they're framing the sort of subject of food security, whether it's about an individual being able to access sufficient adequate calories, or whether it's about the security of a food system. So, for example, I kind of get the impression that some of the corporate and government actors are saying, do we have a sustainable agro industry here? And those perspectives, that focus seems to have really different implications, especially because at times there can be contradictions, right? If you have this really sustainable agricultural industry that exports all the food that's produced locally overseas, that can really reduce local food security. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts about those different definitional sort of conceptions of whose food security we're talking about.
Right. Yeah. I think, well, I can take one aspect on that, and this would be actually returning to the civil society perspectives here. And civil society actors, I think, are really the only actors in terms of the writing that we've reviewed that link. So if they're talking about incomes, for example, or inequalities, like inequality of access to land, they will link that to inequality of access to land and to sufficient food, or food sufficient for a life that I would value. So they were generally pretty good at linking the various dimensions of food security together, whereas corporate communications, government communications, even communications from multilateral actors, if it was on nutrition, it was sticking on nutrition, and there wasn't much attention to these other aspects of food security. So if availability, accessibility, if we buy DeShooter's framework, and you know, these are the three dimensions of food security that are worth talking about in this context, and we've got these stakeholder viewpoints. I think it's civil society groups who really shine through as the only ones who are trying to develop their thinking on linkages between the various aspects. I don't know, did you have something you wanted to maybe add to Kate's question? Because I don't think I got to half of it.
Well, I generally agree with what you're saying, because with the government and so with the government perspective, for example, they're promoting, say, palm oil production, they're just promoting palm oil production without contextualizing it in terms of palm oil production for what? So palm oil production for export, or palm oil production for internal consumption. And I think a lot of the literature, which also goes back to the civil society, which was a lot of stuff in Cameroon was about the Heracles farm, and there was a critique about how, you know, promoting palm oil production, Cameroonians don't necessarily need more palm oil, which is just part of you using it to cook. Cameroonians don't need it in terms of ensuring food security, but if you're promoting major palm oil production, that would be just for export. And so, and even in terms of looking at the food specifics, it's mostly within the civil society groups that you would hear talking about cassava, gari. So really drilling into the actual foods that people eat and really talking about them. Meanwhile, the government would just be talking about extension without necessarily contextualizing in terms of, okay, in the Southwest province, there's this type of dietary specific need, and that's what we should focus on in that region. They're just talking about extension in general and promoting Cameroon open for business.
Yeah, I mean, sticking with the palm oil too, you've got civil society actors who would absolutely challenge this government opinions on the need for more palm oil investment, or the fact that it could be sustainable. But they would also say that you could actually make Cameroon, for example, currently has a palm oil deficit, so they're importing palm oil to meet the needs that people are demanding in the market. And civil society groups suggest that smallholders could just be capacitized with little investments in some transformation technology, and you're going to fix the palm oil deficit almost instantly, because a lot of it's just rotting on the street and not actually getting to people who want it. So civil society would talk about that kind of little direct intervention that would have a big impact, whereas governments are looking to the big, Olam, which is one of the world's biggest commodity firms, is interested in going back up the chain. They don't want to just be trading commodities; they now want to produce it, and they also want to produce the inputs. So they're building a fertilizer plant in Libreville, and now they're also expanding upon their palm oil plantation there. So there's some serious inattention to linkages from governments, and I think the multilateral organizations are kind of guilty of it too, at least in the literature we reviewed.
Do you find if perspectives of one stakeholders are influenced by others, like civil society's perspective are influenced by the donors because they do collaborative research and
Well, I mean, it's a good point, because I think there are some aspects of our data that we still haven't even gotten to take a look at. Another way of analyzing our data would be to take a look at multilateral reports or bilateral reports and see how many civil society reports are cited within those. So that's another way that we could really address that question, I think. But I do think that voicing is very distinct here between multilateral, say if we stick with that one, and civil society groups. And it's, if you talk about adequacy, it's this overarching focus on nutrition, and civil society groups who are very much more connected to agricultural areas and where areas where investments are planned or proposed. Oftentimes not just talking about nutrition, but again, trying to link that to other issues, or are people going to be able to afford food once this project is put into place? The multilateral might focus on sustainability and the sustainability of that proposed oil palm project. It's on everybody's mind in Central Africa, in Central Africa generally. I think these very large agricultural projects, but multilaterals don't seem to be making the link, that jump to let's talk about these other aspects and the impacts. So I'm not sure if I answered your question. We got to look at the data again. I think that's the short answer.
That's a question about why this touches on the very end of the presentation. You said that one of your future research questions is the voices of regular people. I can think of a lot of reasons why that might matter. My hunch is also that is a really neglected part of research on food security. I want to know why you think it matters, particularly if one of the implications of the research I think that you've done is that there aren't really that many effective mechanisms for mediating the conflicting perspectives of existing stakeholders, all of whom have much more power than regular people. So if multilateral organizations are sometimes sidelined, like why do you think it's important that we hear the voice of regular people? Is there some chance that their voices might count in policy design at some future stage? I'm just curious to know why you want to know about the voices of regular people.
Good. I think in terms of the importance of the household perspective, of individual perspective, I think first of all they are the ones who were experiencing the food insecurity, and I think Adam mentioned the fact that most of these reports were elite reports, so people who are living good lives in Yaoundé and all the rest, and who could afford the food. But meanwhile, if you're talking to a regular person on the streets in Boya who goes to the market and feels the price differential, and really experience the fact that people are coming from Gabon, which is doing well or doing better, coming from Equatorial Guinea doing better, and buying up the food that they previously could afford, then you kind of get a different message in terms of what food, first of all, in terms of food preference, what food did you want to buy, and why is it not available, and what season is not available, and all of those little nuances which would come out from the household perspective. Just for example, I think the other example that I would give would be looking at, because I did my research in Botswana, looking at the perspective from when they did the household survey and I did my own household survey versus when they did the first phase of the work was just similar to what we did, which is looking at different kind of looking at perspectives. You talk about, for example, Botswana, food secure, because if you're looking at availability, access, looking at government reports, they might have a deficit in terms of production, but they imported enough, so everything is good. But when you talk to the households, people are telling you, well, yeah, there's food on the shelves, but I can't afford it. Or I can only afford maize meal and instant soup every day. And so you start getting to a different type of food security, I would say, which is more about what people's perspective or people's own qualitative interpretation of whether they are full or satisfied with their food.
But that's about their concrete experience.
Yes, the concrete
security.
experience.
That's different from their views on food security, and that's kind of what I was curious. I understand that the input is very important, that you need to know on the ground what the situation is, but why, in addition to that, do you suggest that you might be interested in knowing what everyday people's perspectives on food security are, like which aspects they, I don't know, I suppose there's a lot
I
of...
think any part of it is to try to get the perspective of people out there, just in general. I mean, there's Mo Ibrahim's prize for good governance in Africa wasn't awarded again. This is the 4th time out of 7 years, so this last month. This is the prize given to leaders after they leave power and have demonstrably changed the economy in ways that could potentially be considered to be positive for people. Well, in CMAC, you've got this kind of persistence of authoritarian rule, like Nguesso basically pushed his cousin out. Sorry, I'm thinking about Obiang. Obiang, yeah. So the president of Equatorial Guinea has been in about 30 years. Paul Biya is 31 years. Denis Sassou Nguesso in Congo Brazzaville was recycled from a previous. He's been in 19 years total. People in Libreville. I mean, Bongo too is in charge in Libreville, but he wasn't necessarily elected in a free and fair election the other year. So there's some real questions about the ability of people in power there to even hear their own people. and get that information out. I mean, the media is not necessarily free. Government newspapers don't cover wouldn't cover any of this. So getting some of this information out to a community of researchers, like here's actually what real people are thinking, might have some impact, at least among the elites that we're reviewing in this study. Now, where some of this comes from is also from Lauren's research on buy and sellums in the markets in Cameroon, talking about, maybe if you wanted to.
No, but also households themselves. So I did a lot of interviews in households and buying sellers. And if the perspectives of these stakeholders are marginalized, then the perspectives of these households are absolutely marginalized and not heard in this case, especially when it comes to food security. Though households are being interviewed to talk about climate change, what's your experience of climate change, what's happening with the weather, but no one knows at this point, in terms of research, what people's experiences of food security and insecurity in the household are. So what are the particular coping strategies that people in CNAC adopt when prices rise or when plantains disappear to neighboring countries, etc. So I think shifting to the voice of the people, I think, was kind of interesting, because this approach that we've taken here with this paper is entirely new. And so and I think bringing the funnel down a little further to the household level is even newer.
I mean, a short answer to the question again is people were telling you last summer in survey data that they don't feel food secure unless they've got access to traditional forest foods. And so the forest Congo Basin literature has kind of overwhelmed food security attention to the region as a whole. That's one of the rationales for a project. But I think there is a definite felt need for foods from the forest. It might be commercialized, it might be able to be domesticated, but people aren't getting access to that now. It's cheaper to go and eat imported rice and fish from China with a little imported tomato. That's the cheapest blade in the market right now. And so whether or not an economist would say, well, that's crazy. People, the revealed preference is for rice. Why are you talking about what people, if Steve's laughing about, I don't know if any other economists are in the room right now. Yes, there is one right here. Yeah. So hopefully that gets at some of your questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.